this. But let me ask you about, what do you think about old books? You like old books?
They're dusty.
They're dusty. Why are they dusty?
Oh, they're old.
Because they're old. Kind of circular logic, isn't it? You know, we talk about old books in a lot of different ways, but I brought this one from my library home. I got to tell you, this is one that I don't know how I got, because somebody sent it in the mail as a subscription, but it wasn't to me. And if you ever try to send books back that you have gotten by mistake, it's worthless to try. You take it to the post office and say, well, we can't do anything about that. You mark it not here, and they just leave it in your box. And so I thought, if you're going to let me keep it, I'll just keep it. And so there's a couple of volumes I got like this. This one, though, is a volume that has three ancient writers to it: Plato, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. And you may not know those names completely, but they are extremely ancient writers. Plato was a few hundred years before Christ. Epictetus was about the same way. Marcus Aurelius was in the 2nd century A.D. Now, those things are not that important, but the reason I brought this is that these books are still being used today. For instance, this one doesn't have Aristotle, but Aristotle, for instance, was a student of Plato's, and Aristotle, his works are still being used to teach public speakers today. Every speech has three good parts to it. That's not your points. They have to have these things. They have to have something to think about, something to feel about, and a character of the speaker that will make him believable. It still holds true today. That's 2,000 years old, roughly 2,500 years old. And so it's still being taught today. All of these things in this book you get in college. And you know what they teach you in college is, these are the actual words that they said. We know what they said. I want you to think about that for a moment. The nearest one to us in terms of time is roughly 2,000 years old. But they are taught as being authentic, realistic, and in some cases authoritative in some ways. So the problem comes when they come to the Bible. Well, just have to operate on the speed of my brain, I guess. Well, when it comes to the Bible, one thing that happens is it's being chiseled away. You come to the Bible and people go, I don't know. It just seems like such an old book. It's from a different time. It was written in a different language, and nobody speaks that language anymore. And nobody does anything else. And so it's kind of like water dripping on a rock. It begins to wear it away. Today, we do that. We listen to that on a constant basis. You can't believe the Bible because it's not true. It's too old. It's not authentic. You don't know what God really said. Whatever. So that's part of the problem with all of this. And as there are two reasons people disbelieve anything. One is they are ignorant of something. The other is they have a bias against it. If you're ignorant about it, it says, I don't know, and so I have an opinion about which I don't know. I know a lot of people who have opinions about things they don't know. And they tend to be very vocal when they tell you about them. And you go, have you considered the facts? And they go, what facts? Well, you see, they need to be educated. But the other is bias. Bias is one of those situations where what we do is we have already made up our mind and we find reasons to confirm what we already believe. Believe it or not, everybody in this room does that some way. From how you think about life or various other pieces, you have a lens through which we all look and say, that's what we already believe, and we look for evidence to support it. Because of that, we have a lot of things that have to happen. And one thing that has to happen is you have one or two things to deal with. You have either hope, which is, I hope the Bible is accurate and true. There's some people who believe that. It's not that there's something wrong with them. They don't really know. And they just kind of hope it is. They're putting their trust in what they're reading in the Bible is what they need to hear. But then there are others who can trust it. There's a difference between hope and trust. The difference between hope and trust is very, very simple. It is the difference in what you know and what you have explored. We look at this and we say something like, I don't know for sure, or I have all these questions. And so the person who knows all the questions will always just have hope. I'm questioning, I don't know what to believe, but I've got all these questions, but I really hope it's true. There are some people who do it like that. And then there are those who they have already found the answers. When you know what the answer is, now you have trust. I know with reasonable certainty that this is true because I have looked at it and I have examined it for everything that it is. To get trust, something has to happen. That is that you have to look in a different way. You have to put things under a microscope and examine them in a way that has to be seen clearly. And so for about 12 weeks, we've been kind of inundating you with information. I'm very much aware that in the last 12 weeks, I have been trying to give you a drink with fire hydrants. I know that. When you have 13 weeks to work with, it's hard to make it small. But we've been trying to put it under the microscope. And you can examine each piece. That's what we've been doing. Each piece we've been examining. But at the same time, there's something else that you have to be able to do. And that's what this lesson's all about, I think. And that is, we have to zoom out. What I'm trying to do with today's lesson is to take 12 lessons worth of very detailed and compress them into a unified whole. Now, I could have done that at the beginning. You wouldn't have come back to class. I'm devious. I need an audience. If I'm going to teach, I need a class to teach. I don't need somebody, oh, I already heard all that. But now you already heard it, so you get to look at it again. That's even worse, I suppose. But we're going to zoom out. We're going to take kind of a global look at all this in ways, and we're going to repeat some things, but try to pull everything together at the same time. When people look at the Bible, they say, it cannot be trusted because it has so many problems. Now, you've been with us all 12 weeks. You know we've talked about a lot of these. But the term problem is problematic, if you will. In that, a problem usually is defined by people as something that's insurmountable. I don't know what it is. I can't fix this. I can't get over this. It's an obstacle in my way, and nobody really knows. That's how we've been taught to think, in a sense, about problems. And so, that's the question. Does the Bible have problems? The truth is, it doesn't have problems. It has issues. And so, there are several issues we've looked at over 12 weeks. First issue is that we don't have originals. We don't have the gospel. We don't have the Gospels as they were written by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John in the original form. In other words, we don't have the piece of paper that they put the pen down on to write it. It's not like the Declaration of Independence where you can go to Washington, D.C., look under that piece of glass and say that's what they really wrote in 1776 in Philadelphia. We don't have that. It's reality at that point. Another issue, though, is because that is true, all we have are copies of copies. And as most people understand, a copy of a copy seems to get degraded over time. It does on copy machines, in fact, and that's part of the problem. People will say, because all you have is copies of copies, it can't be accurate. Because it has degraded over time. And that's kind of a difficult thing to address for a lot of people. They don't want to know all of that stuff, but they hear it and they don't know how to respond to it. A third issue is, because we have copies of copies, we have another problem, which is we really don't know because that the Bible omits some books. You know, it's funny because we looked at a couple of lessons where there's a whole bunch of books that are not in the Bible that some people say ought to be. There are some that are in certain editions of the Bible that are not in ours. If you have a Catholic friend, and they open up their Bible, it doesn't have 39 books in the Old Testament. It's got more. What do you do with that? You say, those aren't original. How are you going to make that argument? What are you going to say? Well, you just don't know, do you? Well, do you know why not? That's part of the problem. And so there are books that are not there, and that's the reality as well. Nothing has been changed in all of that. It's just the way it is. And because of that, it brings up this issue. It cannot be trusted because it has so many problems. But those are not problems, those are issues to address. This is a problem of assumptions. You and I both have assumptions in life. When you got up this morning, you assumed some things. You assumed you would start breathing. Didn't you? I hope you did. You didn't think about it much. You just assumed that was going to happen. You assumed the sun was going to come up in the east. What if you had gotten up and all of a sudden you glanced off the west and the sun's coming up? What would that have done to you? Now that would have gotten your attention, wouldn't it? And so we deal with assumptions all the time. And the assumption being made by a lot of people is the Bible is not accurate because we have all these issues we have to deal with. But the problem is the issues are not the problem, the assumptions are the problem, so we can deal with the issues if you can have an open mind about them. And that's kind of what we're going to do today as we address what they really mean in kind of a global sense. This is a simple idea of sifting. Sifting is like taking a funnel. And if you take a lot of rocks, some of which are big, some of which are small, some of which are sand, some of which are medium, and you throw them all in the funnel, it will finally sift everything out of that funnel in the order it needs to go. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to throw all this stuff in the funnel and let it sift all out and find out what the realities are rather than the assumption. To do that, we have to start with the very first one. The very first one was, if you remember, we don't have the originals. The originals are not there. We don't have them. We admit that up front. Nobody I know is going to be able to say with any kind of certainty, we have just found the Gospel of John is written by John. Not going to happen. It's just not. The assumption then is we can never really know what was truly written if you don't have the original. That's the assumption. People assume because we cannot read the original words on the original paper, we don't really know. Well, the problem with that is multitudinous, if you will, because that's not, the assumption is untrue. Because there's evidence to back up that we have the ability to sift it and find it what it is. We talked about textual criticism in one class. That takes those old scrolls, puts them all together, tries to compare each and every one of them. There's a lot to do. And as you do that, you can begin to see what has been added, changed, degraded over time, so we can recover the very words that were originally written. It's an important point, because sometimes we don't know what to do with that as it works out. Because that's a lot of work, and we don't understand all of that. And it's really difficult for us as people like this, just sitting in Bible class do, because you have to trust some people know what they're doing. And the other is, all we have is copies of copies. And the problem with copies of copies is the assumption is if you have that, they're all full of errors. After you get past the first one, they just messed it completely up. And now you're copying an error, and they'll have another error and copying another error. And that's true about a lot of things. Now, it's interesting what happens is, we know that's true. Have you ever seen a little boy? This happened more often when I was a kid than now, I think. I don't know. You probably get sued for doing this today if you're a teacher. Go up on the blackboard, write 100 times, "I will not talk in class." Now, I knew a teacher, she had a very complex sentence she wanted this kid to write. After about the third one, he was so bored, he didn't know what to do. And suddenly, he forgot words, he'd leave out characters, he'd transpose it, he wouldn't even look at what he had looked at, he's just now coming out of his head. And by the time he got to the end, you couldn't recognize the first sentence. That's how we think. Some people think that's how the Bible got put together. And so all we have is a mishmash of a bunch of stuff that people have added, changed, whatever, and we can't really know what the Word of God is. And the truth is there are a lot of variant readings. We have looked at some of those, and I'm just going to bring up one again because I'm going to illustrate later in the lesson based upon this text. There's a variant reading in the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, the question is did Mark write it? I'm not saying is it not inspired. I'm saying did Mark write it? So two different things, by the way. And so when you look at this, you find out there's a lot of things going on. First of all, you know there are some translations in the Bible that put it in brackets and explain it at the end. They said, I don't know if we ought to have this, but here it is in case you want to have it. The other is that there are some places they don't put it there at all and just put a footnote that has been deleted, and because Mark didn't write it. That's an editorial decision, but it's probably a pretty good editorial decision. The problem when you look at these things, people say the Bible's shot full of problems. That's not accurate either. It's not that the Bible's shot full of problems. There are a lot of variant readings, but at the same time, they can be recovered. We can use textual criticism to figure that out. But the other is that it's an interesting problem because of what it really means. And you just think about what kind of evidence is available to us today. There's all kinds of information that's available to us. In the last 200 years, I mean, we're talking about the last couple centuries, we have found so many different sources, and we went through all of these with more detail. And some of them come back to almost the first century. They're in the middle of the second century. They're within 50 years of when the events happened. That's a key phrase that we're going to deal with as we get over time. And so these things are there. They're available. They can be studied. They're in libraries. Scholars have access to them. And so they can look at these and say, what seemed to be the original text? And so they look at these varied readings and they say, since we have so much information, we can find out what it is. Now, there's more available manuscript information in the Bible than any other ancient document. Remember our dear friends, Plato, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius? In full-scale universities, they teach this as it being accurate. When you find out in the New Testament, at least, look at what the evidence is. There are 5,700 Greek copies. It's a lot. Some go back to the 2nd century. There are 10,000 in Latin because that became the language of the empire. There are 15,000 in other languages, such as the Egyptian language called Coptic, by the way. If you don't know what Coptic is, if you will drive down Campbell and past Plano Road on the right-hand side, there is a church with a white dome. It is a Christian church. Christian, I'll put that in air quotes. But it's the Coptic church. It goes all the way to Egypt, probably, and they say from the Ethiopian nobleman, but that's a supposition. Let's just think about it. We've got all kinds of different manuscripts available to us. But then when you turn and say, well, but they teach this as being accurate too. Well, let's look and see what happens when that happens. You look at this, I wanted you to see this, because these are major authors of history. Caesar, that's Julius, by the way. You've got Sophocles, who was a dramatist. Pliny the Younger was a historian. If you look and see, they got these times when they were written. Pliny the Younger talks about, by the way, Christian persecution during the time of John's exile on Patmos. Tacitus is there. Older ones, such as Plato, is 427 BC. Aristotle, our friend from Rhetoric, he's about 350 years before Christ was born. Just look at that list. These are the big guns of classical history. But I want you to notice this. Let's go back, say, Plato. Plato was the basis of the American government system, by the way. He wrote the Republic. The earliest copy we have is from 900 AD. There's a space of 1,200 years between when it was actually written and the first copy. Question, how do you know Plato's accurate? And you'll notice there are only 7 copies of Plato, original copies, out of that time frame, 900 AD, of Plato. But you pick up, Plato's right here. Oh, wow, Plato's great, isn't he? He's smart. He's wonderful. You go down to Pliny the Younger, who writes some about the church, and he's from the end of the 1st century. And you'll notice almost 750 years passed between when he lived and wrote and first copy, and there's only 7 of his too. Nobody disputes Pliny the Younger. Nobody. Then Aristotle, our friend from Rhetoric, there's a 1,400-year gap between what he wrote and the first copy we have. And out of that, there are only 5 copies of that from which everything has been produced. And so that's the most you get. Now here's the question. If society says these are accurate with less information, why do they say the Bible is not accurate with more information? It's the assumption that's being made for that. And it's interesting that intellectual honesty, by the way, requires you to look at this with the same eye that you look at the Bible. If you're skeptical about the Bible because it has copies, then why aren't you skeptical about Aristotle? That's what it takes. That's intellectual honesty. The truth is, though, that in nature, most of those are fairly minor. What I mean by that is you've got some things that are misspelled words, inverted words, and so they're not that big a deal, if you will. I like this from Ben John Anthony Hort. You probably don't know him, but Hort and his companion scholar named Westcott put out a Greek text called Westcott Hort's Greek text, New Testament, one of the better ones that had ever been produced. When he says this, he looks at all these things. You put together a Greek text, you got to look at everything. He says only about 1/8 of all the variants had any weight, had any importance at all. Most of them are mechanical. Misspelled words, changes of style, inverted letters, whatever else. On the whole, only about 1/16 of the trivialities, or in any case could be called substantial. And he said that comes out to be that the text is 99.33% pure. Now that's close to ivory soap, folks. Remember that? Yeah, you may be too young to remember that. 99.9% pure or something, what the commercial said. 4104. I always want to know what's that 66 100 is. But They never explain that. But Hort says, if you look at this, it's all there. It's not important stuff anymore. It's pretty trivial what you're looking at, and it is. And some of it's pretty obvious as well when you look at it. Most of them are minor, but in addition to that, they don't really make any difference. They don't change anything. They change nothing. For instance, if you went back to Mark 16, we looked at just a moment ago, and you took out all of 9 through 20, and said, Mark didn't mind that, we're not included, you lose nothing. People would say, well, what about baptism? Look at the book of Acts, it's there. Look at Matthew 28, it's there. If you don't have the end of Mark, you don't have lost anything. You can still obey God the same way. You can still know what the message is. And because of that, it's important to understand it that way. That is, if they're there, they don't make any difference on how you believe. They're jump ball questions, perhaps, but they don't make any difference. Sir Frederick Kenyon, a Bible scholar and archaeologist, said one more word of warning, already referred to this as an input, and it must be emphasized in conclusion. No fundamental doctrine of the Christian faith rests on a disputed reading. The nature of Christ doesn't. The presence of the Lord's Supper doesn't. Baptism for forgiveness of sins doesn't. Nothing rests on a variant reading. Not one thing. And he finally goes on to say, it cannot be too strongly asserted that in the substance, the text of the Bible is certain. It's a hard word for scholars to pronounce, by the way. Certain. He says it's certain. So when you look at all those things that we've looked at in that wonderful lesson, they're important to know about, but they're not going to change your faith, no matter which side of the issue you come into. Well, the Bible omits books. Well, we had a couple lessons on all of that, both New Testament and Old Testament. And because of that, the assumption is we don't have the authoritative voice of God. We don't really know what God said because we don't have it all. We have about every third word. But if we had all of it, we would know more about what God says, but something's being suppressed that God wants to tell us, but we haven't been allowed to hear it. And that's kind of the extremist view, but it's kind of the way it sounds if you cut through all the palaver. And the truth, though, of the assumption is that it's not like that at all. The assertion is that this was a political thing that was concocted by church councils to control the masses of the people, and therefore the Bible is nothing more than a flawed book made by flawed humans to promote a particular ideology that I don't want to believe in. That's what's being said today, one way or another. That it's nothing more than a human book that has gone through human editions and it cannot be relied upon to tell you anything. Well, the problem with that is this. I like this. This is a quotation from Mark Twain. I like this. I like Mark Twain for a lot of reasons. He's kind of sarcastic. I kind of like that. But Twain said, get your facts straight, then you can distort them as you please. There are a lot of people that don't have any facts and they still distort it. At least learn what the facts are, and then if you want to lie about them, that's your business. But don't parade that your lack of knowledge is truth. Get your facts straight before you do anything else. If you do that, then at least you have to argue against what is real, not what is not. Which promotes a simple idea about where did they really come from. In the Old Testament Apocrypha, we know where they came from. We know why they are in Catholic Bible. And the reason is because in 1545, the Council of Trent said to put them in. They weren't there before. We know where it came. We know that. Without question. We also know this, that the Gnostic Gospels, those New Testament things that were supposed to be added in, that were taken out, they're never quoted, they're never cited, they're never put any edition of a standard text anywhere, ever. In fact, most of these things weren't even found for the last 300 years. How could they have been omitted if they weren't available? That's part of the problem. That if you look at the facts are these. You can now distort them as you please, but that's not reality at that point. So what do we do with all this? You look at it, and there's some things happening. One is, those books were never in the Bible in the first place. Ever. Never. They were never part of any text that was used in an authoritative way. So when people say that they have been omitted and we need to have them to know what God says, they are kind of talking out of the wrong side of their head. They were not admitted, they were never admitted, for that matter. And so the question is, you got to examine it. Through this class so far, we have said the only thing that matters is what's the reality of this. The Bible is factual. The Bible is accurate, not because we say that it is. It points, we believe that because the evidence points us in that direction. It's important to do that because if you don't, it's just called blind bias. We don't have blind bias. We have good reasons to believe the Bible is the Word of God. At least the text is accurate the way it is. To do that, though, you have to do some things that most people are kind of afraid to do, if you will. You have to be consistent. If you're going to apply a test to the text of the New Testament or the Old Testament, you better be prepared to apply that to any other ancient document. If you give a pass to Plato because he's Plato, but you don't give that same pass to the New Testament, something's wrong with logic. Something's wrong with the ideas. So be consistent about what's there. And then you can make a decent enough argument about things. Beyond that, there's even more that has to happen. You need to have a way to test it out. The Bible is never afraid to be tested. Become a skeptic for a while. I don't believe that's true. Go find out. The man who asks questions and finds the answers is sure of his faith. The Bible is not shy about being tested. So go test it out. Because if you don't, you run a risk that is pretty true for most people. There is this passage at the end of the book of Acts, Acts chapter 28. Paul has made his way to Rome. He's kind of under house arrest, but he's not. As he gets there, something happens. He meets with Christians in Rome. And it says that he explains the kingdom of God from the law of Moses and the prophets and tried to persuade them about Jesus. Now this is the Apostle Paul preaching. You would think he's pretty good at this. It says that some were convinced by what he said, but others would not believe. And he explains that, at least Luke does. He says, if you'll go back to Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, I can explain to you folks why you're not believing this. He says, you will ever be hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. What's the problem? It's not what the Bible does, it's what people do with the Bible. That's the big issue. I always like a concept called Pascal's proposition. You may not have heard this. Remember, I had a friend that I ended up baptizing, but he grew up in a home that never even owned the Bible. have to start a lot farther back. You can't say, let's start in Genesis. Then go farther back. And so what I did was, I was kind of tap dancing my way of trying to figure out what to do. So I told them this story. So Blaise Pascal. Pascal was a mathematician. And he was a believer in God in a world that didn't believe in God. All of his friends were atheists. Well, Pascal was talking to one of them one time, and the guy was basically saying, I don't believe anything that you say is true. Pascal said, let's test that out. He said, let's assume that you are right and I am wrong. That there is no God. At the end of our life, we both die, are buried, and nothing else happens. You have gained nothing. And I've lost nothing. He said, but let's assume on the other side of the equation that I am correct, that there is a God in heaven, that there will be a judgment one day, there is an afterlife, there's something's going to happen, and we both die. On that day, you have lost everything, and I have gained everything. He said, which would you rather be? The truth is, that's kind of what this proposition is as well.